How do the animated adaptations of J.R.R. Tolkien's work hold up? This is Systematic Ecology. We are the priest to the geeks. And I am your resident of the Shire and co-host, Kevin Schaefer. Joining me today, we have some great co-hosts here. First off, fellow Hobbit, Christian Ashley, one of the residents here. Christian, how are you today?
And I'm all right. I'm glad. I'm ready to talk about these films. We got some
I
things to say
am
today.
I am so excited. And this episode, where we're looking at the animated adaptations of The Hobbit, the Ralph Bakshi, Lord of the Rings, and then The Return of the King, we could not do this one without our resident Middle Earth expert. He just wrote a book on the intersection of Tolkien and pop culture. So Gandalf himself, Nick Polk, how are you today?
Yeah.
Oh, Gandalf himself. It's high praise. It's high praise, as Nicolas Cage would say. But I just love that we've got that you're thinking about second breakfast. And, Christian, you're my precious as well. But I'm doing great. I'm excited. This is going to be so much nerdy fun.
This will be a blast. And with the War of the Rohirrim movie coming out this weekend, we thought, what better time? And also, all of these films just dropped on Max. So if you haven't seen them and you want to go back and watch those first, then come back to this. Feel free. But yeah, we're gonna get deep into as much as we can about the production of these, what we thought of them, all of those nuances. So I'm really excited to get into that. Before we do, though, guys, what have you been geeking out on? Christian, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. I bought in a sale not too long ago Baldur's Gate 3 for the first time, and I have really been enjoying it. I'm in the third act now, about to get to the end of the game. It's a lot of good fun.
Very cool. I have heard great things. I know it's like the D&D aspect of it and everything is just really cool. So yeah, Nick, what about you?
I have been into the TV show Yellowstone, and so I'm in
Nice.
the middle of watching the second half of the last season, rather. And so we just finished the penultimate episode last night, and I'm waiting for the finale without Kevin Costner, alas.
I really need to get into it, but I did see this summer the Costner's Horizon and American Saga, which I really liked, actually. Like, that one got a lot of negative reception and it didn't do well at the box office, but I quite enjoyed it, and I love Westerns. So
yeah, I love Kevin Costner. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's what we're checking out. And then for me, just two quick hits, which I'm sure we'll do episodes on later to talk about more in depth, but Skeleton Crew. Yeah, I was telling Christian right before recording, it is off to a great start. I did not know how much I needed the Goonies meet Star Wars, but I'm loving it so far. And then Creature Commandos, marking the sort of official launch of James Gunn's DC universe. And even though Superman will be the really big launch pad, this is the first show technically in that canon. Also, very enjoyable premiere. Great animation, very Suicide Squad feel with the monster element. So I'm very excited for that to continue. So I've got some good shows to go through the holidays right now. So very cool. All right, guys. Well, let's get into it. So again, we will be talking about the 1977 Rankin Bass The Hobbit, then the Ralph Bakshi Lord of the Rings, which is a loose adaptation of Fellowship of the Ring and Two Towers, and then also the Rankin and Bass Return of the King. So we got a lot to talk about here. So let's get into it, starting with The Hobbit, which is really a seminal classic, was aired as a TV special in 77. And, I can start off for both of you. What's your background with this adaptation and then with the novel in general? Nick, we'll start with you. Like, were you just like a Tolkien expert out of the womb, or was it like, I'm trying to get into the origins here. So like, what was like your first exposure with The Hobbit?
Yes, he said, "Mother, I require milk and a Silmarillion."
Yes, and a pipe with tobacco. Yes. So I think I talked about this before. So on the podcast, my Nana used to own a video rental store back in the day. And so before I was of age, she sold it, but she kept all of her the movies that she wanted and movies that she figured her grandchildren would love. And The Hobbit was one of those. And of course, being 5, 6, 7, had no idea about the larger world of Middle Earth. But I watched The Hobbit. She had like the weird CBS Chronicles of Narnia special, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I watched all those. And so my mom actually, when I first joined the Tolkien Society, my mom, who keeps everything, sent me like a little second grade picture that I colored of a leprechaun for St. Patrick's Day. And I had named one of the dwarves, I think it was Dwalin maybe. And I think that Dwalin is described as having a blue beard. And I had even made a blue bearded leprechaun. And so I at least had the details right, you know. So then of course it stayed in the background with me, and then just has gone with me as I've grown in my Tolkien nerddom.
I love it. And Krishna, what about you? Was it like did you watch this movie first or read the book? Where do you remember?
I definitely watched the movies first. Not the Hobbit movies, but I did watch, the original Lord of the Rings trilogy
Yeah.
first. As those were releasing, and then my dad, I want to say maybe after Return of the King had come out, had said, "Hey, you know that they animated like the other thing, right? The Hobbit," and he had seen it as a kid, so he went out on eBay on something and bought it, and we watched it together, and we had a grand old time together, just watching this, 70s campy but fun flick that's fairly, I mean, faithful for the most part. And then after the fact, that's when I started reading the books. And The Hobbit is actually the one I've reread the most because it's just not to say the others are inferior in any way, shape, or form. It just feels softer and gentler. It's just fun adventure time.
It really is. I mean, I knew another big Tolkien expert in college who read The Hobbit every year. And it is, I think it is one of those times of classics where it is so accessible. It's just this like very contained narrative, a whimsical, comforting story that you can come back to time and time again. So for me, yeah, I actually do remember watching the animated films first back when I was a kid because I remember the Bakshi one pretty well. I'll get to that in a little bit. And so I don't remember, but I think it was that one I saw first, and then the Rankin Bass ones. But I remember watching those as a kid, and then of course watching the Peter Jackson trilogy, and then reading the books a little bit later after that. But yeah, I think The Hobbit, this one has a really, there's an instant sense of nostalgia to it with the Glenn Yarborough kind of folk ballads as the main soundtrack, and then
gosh, yeah.
it's just so good. And then Rankin Bass, of course, being the primarily associated with the Christmas specials that we all watched as kids. So Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Santa Claus is Coming to Town. So it was just that instant world and nostalgia and animation that really resonated with a lot of us. And so and I think for The Hobbit, it does it captures that feel really well. So yeah, looking at this adaptation, what was your overall impression, both upon revisiting it or thinking back to when you first saw it as kids? Nick, what about you?
Yeah, just going back, I loved it as a kid, and it was one of those movies that because it's even with like the Rankin and Bass stuff, like it captures the darkness of the spiders really well, and even Smaug and stuff like that. And even as I rewatched it, kind of felt the same way. I was like, dang, this is, and I feel like the adaptation for the most part is pretty faithful, with a few, they took away a couple of things, they cut a couple of things, but it's probably closer to the book than even like the Peter Jackson Hobbit trilogies, in my opinion.
I did laugh when we got to the Battle of the Five Armies sequence, which is less than 5 minutes here, and probably like a paragraph in the book. And we get to that point, and I was like, "Oh, Jackson watching here." Like, why don't we just make this an entire movie here? But yeah, I do love it. But you're totally right about like aesthetically. When you look at the spiders, the goblins, Gollum, I mean, like there's a darker tone here that it still captures quite well. So even for the more whimsical aspects of the story, there is still that darkness present that I think that Rankin and Bass understood within Tolkien's universe. Christian, what about you? What was kind of your thoughts either on rewatching or what you thought of it as a kid?
Yeah, initial thoughts, I really loved it earlier on as a kid. It's very also it was kind of my introduction as well to the hokier parts of Tolkien and like the
Mm-hmm.
songs and everything. Is well, okay, I'm not really a musical guy, but in animated form, for whatever reason, I stopped. My prejudices die, so I just accept it on screen. I think maybe because if I see it happen in real life, I go, I can't get behind what's happening here. I don't think people would do that, but I can't just divorce myself from that thought. But like, when I see them in Bilbo's house talking about the things that Bilbo Baggins hates, I'm like, yes, sign me up. I want to hear everything that Bilbo Baggins hates. And now rewatching it like I did a couple days ago, it's made me fall in love with it more. Yes, there are certain parts of it that aren't animated the best. There are certain parts of it that aren't voice acted the best. But you know what? I don't care because I'm having a Hobbit being shown to me in animated form, and it's a fun time. And that's all I ask sometimes. Not everything has to be a critical darling. And I think this actually did
Mm.
fairly well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I did. I mean, like I said, it first aired as a TV special, and yeah, became really big success. And I know people who watch it every year on the holidays. They've introduced their kids to it. I think it's had a really timeless generational impact.
Oh yeah, I
And
think even people talked about like, which stepping ahead of ourselves. I think when um the 1980 Return of the King came out, I think people
mhm,
were like disappointed. They were like, "Dang, this is not like The Hobbit." And
right,
or they
right.
were like, and then other people were like, "It's a little too much like the Hobbit too." At the same time,
And that is a
yeah.
fascinating one to look at. So we will definitely compare and contrast those when we get to Return of the King because there's so much to dissect there. But wait, Christian, you mentioned voice acting. I think so. With all these films, there are several prominent actors they got for the voices. So in this one, John Huston is the voice of Gandalf, which I found fascinating. The filmmaker of Maltese Falcon, and he's in Chinatown. Big Hollywood legend. So you can definitely hear his bolstering voice there, and I really liked. And then there were a couple. I love Bilbo's. The dwarves pretty well. I think some when it gets to like the wood elves and stuff like that, they made some interesting choices there that don't hold up as well. Still works as a whole. But yeah, so I guess let's get into that. What are first off some of your favorite parts from this movie? Nick, do you want to start?
Yeah, I when I was looking back and watched it, one of my favorite parts uh is two things. The intro to Gandalf is
Mm,
just so interesting,
yeah,
like where Bilbo's just smoking his pipe and the smoke comes in, all of a sudden Gandalf comes in with that chord. It's like, "Ba-da-ding," that's throughout the entire film when something mysterious happens. And then the smoke surrounds Gandalf, and he's like Bilbo, which is, I feel like the books have Gandalf as like a more um what's his name? Like Ian McKellen type of I
yeah,
feel
yeah,
like
yeah,
Ian
yeah,
McKellen kind of channels the vibes more
yep.
accurately, but I think we do miss out on the more. I think what the Rankin Bass thing does is Gandalf is mysterious and he is a little more grumpy, I would say, in The Hobbit, and kind of just bails a lot of times. And so I think they bring in that element, which I really enjoyed. So that intro is one of my faves. And then when Bilbo is invisible and like starts killing the spiders with Sting, I just love the animation. Um, I love the like Bilbo is still sounding very whimsical and happy, and he's like, "It's Sting," and he's stabbing and killing, and I just the shining of Sting. So those are the two probably my favorite moments.
Oh, great picks, Christian. What about you?
It Gandalf's introduction is like incoming ham. Let me just say, I'm in the film now. You're gonna love me, Bilbo. And by the way, you're gonna work for me. I just love how pushy it is. I mean, it's not that far off from the books either. Uh, to an extent of like you're in this mess now. You didn't ask for it. You didn't sign up for it, but you are now. That's a good one, picnic. I mean, obviously, I have the image up here on screen if you're on YouTube, and it's the riddle like
Oh yeah.
tests between Gollum and Bilbo, and in the books, it's a really fun thing. You're like, okay, how do you portray like a battle of words between this interesting figure that's like decrepit and like become less than a man versus someone who's like, I have no clue what's going on. I just got into this little like rap fight that I had no preparation for. What's going to happen? And it's portrayed very well here between him bringing out Sting and him finding the ring and then utilizing it against Gollum, and like the voice acting for Gollum. Like, when you're raised on Andy Serkis, and then you go to this, you kind of go, okay, that's an interesting take. Yeah, they both have their valid points. How would you describe this voice, Nick?
Oh, I don't. He's kind of like raspy. Oh, it kind of like Okay,
Like
I'm
it's something
thinking.
stuck in his throat.
Yeah, so I'm thinking. Have y'all seen Over the Garden Wall?
Yes.
Kind of gives me what's Adelaide? Is that her name? The mom? Like, no. Who's the lady who has the turtles? She's the
Oh,
mother who has all the thread.
I haven't seen that since release. I don't remember.
Okay, sorry. That's so. If anybody's seen that, I can't remember the mom's name or the lady. It might be Adelaide, but they kind of have a similar voice.
Yeah.
It is, and
Go
go
ahead.
ahead, Christian. No, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, I love this scene as well, like portrayal of these conflicting forces, like bumbling. I bumbled into this. I have no clue what's going on. Versus like this being who's been alive for however long, and
Mhm.
like it still has enough of a mind to bring these elaborate riddles that I would fail every single one of them because I panic when presented with a riddle. So I like it when someone else succeeds at something that I can't.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think this is one of my favorite scenes by far. They did a good job with the voice acting, the animation. I like how Gollum is just kind of this sluggish, like decrepit, worn down by years of torment over the ring. And it, stays really true to the source material there. As far as one of my just the funniest moments I had rewatching this was in the Battle of the Five Armies, where the way they portray that, they're just like Bilbo's just commenting. He's like, "Oh, there's another one. There's another one." They like all the armies just kind of show up, and they don't really show the battle, and Bilbo just kind of lets it happen and stays off to the side. Which I'm like, this is fitting. I mean, like, yes, he's been through a lot, and he's definitely a more brave and adventurous than when he started out. But also, he's not going to throw himself into a battle that is kind of pointless to begin with. It's not like but I liked how they just kind of like made light of that. But it also led to a more emotional scene with him and Thorin. That is, I will say, the one thing that I think does that the Jackson Hobbit trilogy does better through more
agreed.
time and through is the portrayal of Thorin in particular and that relationship. I think there's a lot more development there. Here, there wasn't a lot of really. There's a little bit between them, but there's not much, and so there was still a good emotional scene there, but it felt a little bit unearned because we hadn't really spent a lot of time with the two of them and those shifting dynamics. So I think that is the one thing where that a 3 movie even too long epic narrative of a shorter book does well is that relationship between Bilbo and Thorin. So that was really good. And then others, we're talking about music. I still really love The Greatest Adventure, which is the opening song there by Glenn Yarborough. Again, it's this like folk ballad that fits so well into this universe. And I was just playing that on repeat after rewatching this. It's just so good. And it has that, I feel like it just as iconic as Howard Shore's is in the Jackson universe. It just fits so well within the Rankin Bass. So those are some of my favorite moments. And then, I do really love like the Flies and Spiders and him waving Sting around, all of those elements.
I think it's super important too. It sticks with the book and the fact that Tolkien doesn't really focus too much on the Battle of the Five Armies, and that's
Right.
because of his own experiences with war. And Nick can probably speak more on that than I can. But like his idea of like this is not a glorious thing that's happening here. You're all letting these petty grievances get in the way. And yes, there's a different force we can fight against here. That's actually the evil person in the room. But like nothing was really gained here. You all fought over something that you had no right fighting over in the first place. So the fact that as opposed to the films, which it's a cool action scene, but it kind of misses the point Tolkien was trying to make is like, this is not a glorious thing. I'm not going to show too much attention to it. I experienced these things, and I'd rather not have anyone else do it again.
Yeah, and it's a children's book and a children's movie, so it can't get too into the weeds with post-traumatic stress disorder and stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and I mean, I think throughout this film, the focus is really there. That's something we'll talk about in Return of the King, maybe not as much here, but for Reagan and Bastille, I think The Hobbit was the perfect story for them to adapt. They really do capture the narrative well. I mean, it hits all the big story elements. It doesn't feel too rushed. I maybe could have used maybe like 15 more minutes because it's only an hour and 15 minutes, I think, hour and 20. Like, it's less than 90 minutes.
Yeah.
So there are certain scenes I could have expanded on, like really the stuff in Lake Town and Smog, and all that happens so fast that I could have liked a little bit more time. That's the other thing. I did really like the design of Smog. It actually reminded me of there was an illustrated version of The Hobbit I had as a kid, and that was some of my favorite parts was the illustrations of Smog there, and it felt very similar there. So I really like that sequence, but yeah, I could have maybe used a little more interaction with Bilbo and the dwarves and a little bit of Lake Town. But overall, I think it really captures the important story beats. It flows quite well. It works as a children's story. So I probably had some of the most fun rewatching this one after it had been a few years.
Oh yeah, same. And like you said, just don't like the Smaug. I was gonna make a comment. I love the weird fur hair on
Cat
the jowls or whatever.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's good.
It was good, and also that with the dwarves, at the end when some do die, it seems like there's a little bit of missing that time for Bilbo to feel the emotional weight of that. That's another thing that they do focus more on in the live action trilogy. So again, with just a little, maybe an extra scene or two, could have benefited, but for the length it has, I think it captures the story well. There's a lot of really memorable moments. It was very enjoyable on a rewatch. Do you guys have any other thoughts on this one or just Hobbit in general?
I do like how, I mean, obviously these are in the books too, but the whole trope of they're screwed until Gandalf shows up just multiple times over is proven true. It's well, I could solve everything if I had been here in the first place, but it's so much better when I show up and save all you fools multiple times over. And I got to give man props. He knows how to make an entrance. That's why I love him.
Here.
It's a classic every time. Him and the Eagles, they know just when to swoop in. But yeah. Awesome. Well, so that let's move on then to the 1970s. So The Hobbit was 1977. Again, aired as a TV special. In 1978, we had the Ralph Bakshi theatrical film, The Lord of the Rings, which was again a loose adaptation of both Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. And I was actually just watching a big YouTube video, kind of detailing some of the history and how this got made. And there were talks of expanding it into 2 movies or, trying to continue the story. Ultimately, there were issues with making this film as Rankin and Bass were working on theirs. There's all these kind of rights issues that you can go into more in depth on. But yeah, so that's kind of why we got this version that is just Fellowship of Two Towers. There were a bunch of hurdles to get to that point, but I think one of the most interesting things about this movie is the director, Ralph Bakshi. He had a very interesting filmography, especially leading up to this point, doing very controversial, adult-oriented animation films, many of which were quite embraced, others not so much. He pretty much did anything that was antithetical to Disney at the time. And he had apparently wanted to direct Lord of the Rings for a long time. It took a while to get into production. He had to get a different producer on board. It went back and forth between different studios, but eventually did come to theaters. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, this was actually my introduction to the Tolkien universe. So I remember it quite well, watching it on VHS and really enjoying it. And it had a profound impact on Peter Jackson. This was also his introduction to Tolkien before he read the books. And you can see, I think a lot of that is very apparent in both the structure and the animation style. So yeah, let's get into it. What's your background with this movie in particular? And what was your overall impression upon rewatching, or if you saw it a long time ago? So Nick, we'll start with you.
So I watched it in VHS form as well, and so I don't think I came to watch this until after I had seen both Peter Jackson's Fellowship and Two Towers, and I think I had kind of watched it in between the Two Towers and then the theatrical release of Return of the King, kind of like trying to scratch that Tolkien itch. And I remember just being like so weirded out and confused. I was like, as a kid, I remember being particularly afraid of the Nazgul, and not in the same way as I don't think I felt really fear towards the live action Nazgul, but I felt fear for the Nazgul in Bakshi's film. And so I just remember the darkness, and I just remember as a kid, I think it captures like this feeling of like, I don't know how, like, it's disturbing in a lot of ways. Like, it's very, like, I just remember as a kid feeling deeply disturbed by this adaptation, by Boromir's death, the way they animated the rotoscoping, which I didn't know what the term was. It freaked me out. And now as an adult, this movie's so trippy and weird, and I love it just for that. Like, is it faithful? I mean, Bakshi was trying to be faithful. I've listened to interviews. I don't think he's successful in a lot of ways, but I love the movie for what it is. I love that Bakshi too, the context. Like, as I've listened to an interview, back during COVID with somebody, and he intended to do more, but they kind of cut him off. But Bakshi was like just him alone before, like, he was a direct competitor to Disney. Like, Disney was like afraid of him for a while. And just the fact that like Rankin Bass was another studio that was kind of a direct competitor. I like that history, and I like that Bakshi is still alive and kicking and all that good stuff.
Totally. And that's the thing about him and about this film that I respect is just like, like it or not, the artistic vision is 100% there, the commitment to it. And absolutely, I had some of those same thoughts as a kid. I was like, whoa, this is creepy. And I think that's what drew me to it. Like, I was kind of a scaredy cat, like, for like growing up. Like, I'm like a big horror buff now, but I did not watch a lot of horror growing up. But for whatever reason, I was more fascinated by this film. And I think it's that fusion of live action and 2D animation. And the Nazgul, and when it does that sort of murky, diluted animation, and it makes it more gritty and visceral, it's fascinating and terrifying and bewildering all at the same time. So I think that's what really drew me in. Christian, what about you?
Yeah, after we had watched The Hobbit together, my dad also bought this one off of eBay, and we watched it together. Had another fun time, because then I was completely and totally taken by surprise by thinking, "Oh, it's called The Lord of the Rings, so I'm just going to watch the Fellowship, right?" As I know, we're going to add both of them together, smush them, and we'll see what comes out of it. And more Tom Bombadil erasure and all that mess. But at the end of the day, like, this is fine. It does its job well. I think Bakshi, this was a passion project to an extent for him, so I'm behind what he was trying to do. Overall impression, I really do enjoy this film. It's no Hobbit, but it's still good.
Right. Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like animation wise, this like draws me to the most, and it does this style of animation works way better for Lord of the Rings than for Hobbit. This is like captures the more darker elements of Lord of the Rings as an adult story, whereas Rankin and Bass was perfect for The Hobbit. That's what, again, I know we're doing a lot of foreshadowing for when we get into Return of the King in a bit. But yeah, I think this, and I really do wish he had gotten to make another one and kind of finished out the trilogy here. It would have been really interesting. But I guess let's start talking a little bit about I guess what it does well, and some of the differences in the book, and a lot of the things that I had to cram in. Well, first off, just a little detail is I wanted to point out the evolution of so after Frodo gets stabbed by the Nazgul, and they leave Weathertop and are headed to Rivendell. So there's like an evolution there of the elf that shows up to meet them in the book. Nick, remind me of the elf who shows up in the book to meet them. It was a more random one that's not part of the Fellowship.
Yeah, Glorfindel is the one who shows
Glorfindel,
up.
yes. Okay, so Glorfindel shows up in the book, and then in this movie, Legolas shows up, which makes a little more sense. He's part of the Fellowship, so it builds up to it later. But that was, I think, the smartest difference in both adaptations, and eventually, I think they got the most effective one in the Jackson trilogy with Arwen showing up there and making a bigger deal of her character. So that's just one of the things there's not to diss on Tolkien here, but like there are narrative choices that I do think adaptations have done better, and that's one. And this was like a slight improvement, and then I think a better one in the Jackson trilogy. So that's one thing. But I thought that I just had to point out before I forgot. And also a little Easter egg, Anthony Daniels does the voice of Legolas in this, and then John Hurt was Aragorn. Some pretty cool names here. But as far as narrative wise, so it starts off actually quite faithful and really reminiscent of the start of the Jackson trilogy, where it does a sequence with the prologue and the story of the ring and how it went from Isildur to Gollum to Bilbo. And that sequence is done with like live action actors kind of in a silhouetted background where they're in black and white, that I found really fascinating before it gets into the more 2D animation. So I thought I remember watching that as a kid, being really fascinated, like even when I couldn't describe like the language of it, and it was just something about that world building that really drew me in. So it starts off with that, and I also do give it props for actually showing the time gap between when Bilbo leaves after his birthday party to go to Rivendell, and then the years-long gap between that and when Gandalf returns to Frodo. Because that's one thing in the Jackson movies, it makes it look like Gandalf went away for like a night or a weekend and then came back. But here they do show that it was a 17-year gap between Bilbo leaving and then the beginning of Frodo's journey. So it starts off relatively faithful. It veers a lot after that, I think. But let's talk about that. What were kind of some of your favorite parts and how it adapted the story? And maybe we'll get into more areas where it deaves completely or condenses a lot of material.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Nick here. Like Nazgul in this film are done spectacularly well.
Yes.
With the rotoscoping done here, the way everything is animated, like there's a sense of just pure evil in these things as they're encroaching upon our heroes. And I mean, we definitely see some of the inspirations Jackson took here, like the scene where they're just underneath the root of the tree, just hoping and praying that the ringwraith doesn't come after them, is pretty much exactly like that in the film. And the scene of the beds being stabbed as well, like it's just done extremely well. I love that so much. Now, I think out of the two films here, two books being adapted here, Lord of the Rings is the more faithful one because we have less time for the Two Towers. Is 2 hours ish, and you got to split those up. You can't do that. Like there's too much in both of these books for that to be completely faithful. I think it does a well enough job at bringing them together, but there are obvious things missing. I mean, you got the whole thing where Pippin and Merry end up in the forest, and they see there's a tree beard there, and then they're suddenly friends. It's like there was a whole conversation that should have happened right there, but like, nope, we're cool now. And it's kind of jarring, but it's fine. But the fight beforehand between the riders of Rohan and the orcs that had them captured were done extremely well. And Boromir's death is also an extremely great scene. I brought the image up of him that you see kind of around the meme being milking the giant cow, and that's an older term that predates this film. It's more of a theatrical thing of like you gesticulate with your hands, as I often do, to just show what you're thinking and feeling, because that's just a way to emote for the audience, and it's just captured in animated form really well. Yeah, I'd say the Two Towers sections just really suffer because it feels like they wanted to add more, and then we get to, the Battle of Helm's Deep, and it's just like, oh, that was like maybe 10, 15 minutes at most, it feels. Maybe even less, or maybe more. I don't know. It just feels short.
Oh, it's very targeted. Yeah, that is the biggest thing. Fellowship, I think it does a pretty good job adapting. I mean, it covers all the main beats. I would say the main thing there is a lot of the supporting characters get hardly any real development there. Merry and Pippin, Gimli and Legolas. I mean, they're all there, but we get to know them so much more in other adaptations and in the books. But overall, Fellowship hits kind of the main beats. Yeah, there's a lot of memorable sequences, and I really, throughout, I really loved, the depiction of the Shire. I loved the scene in Bree. I loved Rivendell. The Balrog scene was great. I think probably one of the biggest things is cramming Fellowship and Two Towers into one movie is that you really do not feel the emotional impact of Gandalf's death. Because in time he shows up about 30 minutes later. So it's like, whereas, you get that time to mourn in both the novel and in the Jackson film. Here it's like, okay, he's dead, but don't worry, I'll be back in just a little bit. Just stay tuned. And so there's a lot like that. But then also like the Lothlorien scene looked great aesthetically. I really like, Galadriel. And I will say too, I don't know, Nick, if you've listened to interviews with Sean Astin about this, when he got the role of Sam, he's like, all right, now I better not have to talk like the voice in the animated movie, because that is the one thing, because I thought they do a great job with Frodo here. With Sam, they make him look like, oh, sorry, Mr. Frodo. Oh, like he's just like, it's like they just kind of took. Oh, yes. Oh, very much so. And it's like, come on, this is Samwise Gamgee, the MVP. You got to do him more justice here. So that is, as far as character depiction, that's probably my biggest criticism. They give kind of the shaft to Sam, and did a pretty good job with most of the others. But yeah, animation wise, it's great. There's a lot of things it does well, but I think structurally and narrative wise, Two Towers is where it suffers the most. There's really, especially upon a rewatch, I'm like, okay, yeah, it hits some of the Wikipedia beats here, but there's so much it leaves out, and there's not really a narrative thread that connects a lot of this. And especially at the ending where Gandalf gets this kind of brief monologue to sum things up, it makes it sound like the Battle of Helm's Deep was the end of things, and that was the and I'm like, this doesn't add up if you're just watching this as a movie, because you're like, you just had a scene where Gollum is plotting to kill Frodo and Sam right before this, but and this battle is happening leagues away from them, but that somehow marks the end of Sauron, and like, this doesn't add up here. So there's a lot there contextually missing. But again, I like Nick, like you said, there were a lot of constraints there on Backey's part. I think he did the best he could with what he had, but it would have been better if he had gotten at least 2 movies to spread everything out and to tell a complete story. But for what he does here, I think he does Fellowship pretty well. He gets a lot of the characters in the world building right. But narratively, it could have been a lot better.
Yeah, and that's almost kind of reflective of Jackson too. A lot of hardcore fans will say that Jackson, which is kind of objectively true too, where Fellowship of the Ring is pretty darn close, and then it starts getting a little off the rails. Now, I would argue that Peter Jackson's is definitely more faithful than Bakshi's Two Towers, but also, like you were talking about, there's not those constraints. It's interesting. Treebeard kind of gives me like Wizards vibes. I feel like the Two Towers channels more of like the Wizards vibes. And I feel like Saruman kind of has that kind of vibe too. And we don't really get a lot of time with Saruman like we do in the books or the films. It's very much like, here's Saruman who kidnaps Gandalf or whatever, gives a war speech, blah blah blah.
And we don't get any time with Theoden either. We get and it doesn't really. That's what they were. It's like you get in this film that, okay, he's under some kind of influence of Saruman, but it doesn't really portray the like vivid way that it does in the Jackson movies, where he's like decrepit and under this spell, and then becomes revived by Gandalf. that's not really apparent here. It's just like it looks more like, okay, Grima was kind of tricking him, but then he goes away. But like, there's not as much of that transformative moment. And then yeah, he's barely in it too. I also told Christian right before we started recording, I'm like, man, Faramir got the shaft in this whole like the entire animated universe. He does not appear once. I'm like, poor guy. But yeah.
Before we go on, we do have a comment. Well, a couple comments for the same listener.
Okay.
It's from Ian. Said Bakshi was definitely a maverick and a pioneer. Things like Heavy Metal, Ren and Stimpy, and Futurama all owe him a definite debt. This movie, though, I don't know. Like, hey, agree to disagree on that last part. But yeah, Bakshi definitely over his career. I get it. Like, going over his stuff. Well, I mean, we're about to go there anyways. I think if I'm following the outline correctly, I mean, we've got wizards, fire and ice, cool world. There's there's a lot of cool stuff that he does with this film, and he also says. He's actually kind of glad that Bakshi ditched this slower business to get back to his own original stuff, which, yeah, I get it. This is definitely a passion project that took him away from other projects he could have gone on.
Yeah, and it's something, he spent years working on, just trying to get the rights, and there was a lot,
actually, Fritz the Cat, you'll actually go. There we go.
Oh, okay, yeah,
something
Fritz
of
Cat,
adoption, too. I think maybe yeah. So thank you for your comments, Ian.
Yes, thank you, Ian. We appreciate it, because it's it is a fascinating career to look at it. And also around this time, he became an acquaintance of George Lucas. I was looking at because they were in meetings together around this time, and they not like close collaborators or anything, but I do love just the interconnected cinematic universe of filmmakers out there. It's fascinating to look at. But yeah. So again, the Two Towers of it does the weakest. But let's talk about Gollum for a minute too, because as far as something we'll get into with Return of the King in a little bit is where the focus is a little metal. I think this one, I mean, even though there are a lot of plot points missing, it still captures both like what it does in the novels and the Jackson films of splitting the time between the hobbits and then the men and the elves and the dwarves in those storylines. But looking at Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, there's a lot of imagery here that Jackson was clearly inspired by. But what do you think of those scenes? They do wait to introduce Gollum until where kind of the Two Towers storyline starts. But do you think that was effective?
I have a hard time with those. I'm not gonna lie. Like. When you get to, so I love the film for what it does, but as soon as we get into any parts of the Two Towers, including the hobbits, it gets a little harder to watch. I think like it slows down for me, and like there's elements there that are really good, and I think that this Gollum might be a little more accurate as far as depiction than Rankin Bass is, at least in the Hobbit. And so I don't know I don't really know. Like I think it just kind of slow for me. I think it's because everything's so sped up on the like on the Three Hunter side of things. That it really makes like the pace, the A and B plot just don't really connect, like even at the end, like you were saying, it's like it's over and Gollum is and the hobbits are still on this journey. So yeah, that's probably it for me. Elements that I really like the voice acting, his depiction, and how the hobbits interact, but it's kind of slow.
I agree. There's a lot missing there when you take away so much of the story, and even the conflict between Frodo's empathy for him once he learns more about his background as Smeagol, whereas like Sam is more protective of him. That stuff isn't really here. And then you don't have any of the Faramir and Gondor storyline that is really interesting. So there's just a lot missing. And so, yeah, I agree. It's like there are places where it could have gone, but it doesn't really go anywhere. And there's a lot of just substance text missing. So the animation is solid, the voice acting solid. But it's just the narrative really starts to crumble in the second half. Still enjoyable, but it just makes you, especially, like it's one thing where like if this is your introduction, is one thing watching, but like when you know all of the context of the novels and the Jackson films and everything, it's like everything that's missing.
Right.
But yeah.
This is fine. I don't think I can add anything we hadn't said
Mhm.
before about what's happening here, but like it makes sense with time constraints and studio executives getting into the messing things up. It This is what we got, and I'm fine with what we have.
Yeah.
It's not a perfect, adaptation of it, but it does a well enough job. It introduced people to the books,
Yep.
which is what a good movie should do. That's being based off of something else. It should make you go, well, that's how they interpret it. Let me see what they were interpreting.
Absolutely. And I also want to just touch on briefly, since we talk a lot about music, I do really like the score in this one. It's got like it's a great score here that it certainly balances the tense, darker moments with the more whimsical aspects. I thought it flows quite well, and you can see a lot of the influence for Howard Shore in there. So that's the thing. Again, I feel like everything about the world building, the animation, all that I really love, and a lot of the voice acting is quite good. But that's the main thing. Is just narratively they had to compress a lot, and it does suffer from that. But especially upon rewatching, I still really enjoyed this one overall. So it was fascinating to look at it, and I also definitely recommend looking more at Bakshi's work and all. I think he's a fascinating filmmaker. So
Yeah.
All right, so that is Lord of the Rings, 1978. Now let us get back to the Rankin and Bass universe with the 1980 adaptation of Return of the King. So again, we touched on this that it is bizarre that this studio did The Hobbit, then they go and adapt the final book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy without having done the first two. And keep in mind that these movies are separate from the movie we just talked about. So there's a lot there, but same question to start out with. What was your background with this movie, and what are your overall thoughts? Christian, we'll start with you.
Yeah, same thing. Dad bought it off of eBay after watching the last one, so we kept
Mhm.
going on, and I was like so excited to see what would happen next, and then we come here, and it's not like it's terrible. It's also not like it's good either. We lose like 90% of the cast outside of like, we're also here, guys. Outside the very beginning of the film, and like we're doing stuff too, but really it's the Frodo and Sam show, and Gollum as our special guest star, messing up the apartment or whatever as they're moving across Mordor. Uh, it's fine. It's not good. I don't know. I would hesitate to call it good, but I would say it's fine.
I agree. I think, like, as a kid, I quite enjoyed it. But one of the first things I texted Christian and Nick after rewatching this last week was, "Wow, for a movie called The Return of the King, about that is in reference to Aragorn claiming the throne of Gondor, Aragorn has about as much screen time as Luke in The Force Awakens in this, which it was quite odd. But yes, this is definitely a Frodo and Sam show. Which we'll get to that in a little bit, but like, I guess within the Rankin and Bass universe and the more whimsical nature, that makes a little more sense. But nonetheless, for adapting a book within the Lord of the Rings, that's that kind of storyline approach works much better for The Hobbit than it does here. So we'll get into that more. But Nick, what about you? What are your kind of overall thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I actually never watched this as a kid, and probably
Okay.
didn't watch it until I actually don't think I even knew of its existence until I was in
Mhm.
college. And so I think I probably found it online for free somewhere and watched it. And I think kind of the same vibes where I was like, it's fine,
Mhm.
and as I was doing research looking at it, I can't remember if I didn't look at The Hobbit. There's a Japanese animation studio that did the stuff for this version, and particularly Sam and Frodo in this version look very Japanese
Yeah.
anime influenced. Um, and I don't remember if the same studio does The Hobbit. Do you guys know?
That I would have to
Not off
look up,
the
but
top
that
of
is
my head.
fascinating knowing that now. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't
Yeah.
I don't know if they are. I'm sure there's probably some back and forth that they do, because I know Avatar: The Last Airbender did that with a studio in Korea,
Right.
Yes.
But I think, like, especially Sam and Frodo give me small, like, kind of Hello Kitty Japanese
Yeah,
animation people vibes.
that makes a
Well,
lot of sense, actually. Yeah.
real quick, Ian does bring up a good point here, is that this and The Hobbit were both produced for TV. So
That's
there's that
right.
particular
True.
regard,
Yeah. Great point.
as opposed to the Bakshi film, which is for, a wider release in the theaters. Like, I think you can be a little more graphic to that extent. And of course, TV considerations are a separate thing. So thank you for bringing it up, Ian. That's a great point.
And also, I looked up an interview with Arthur Rickon Jr. About why did they adapt just Return of the King, following up on The Hobbit. And one of his answers was actually that he didn't think or him and Jules Bass didn't think audiences would sit through an epic viewing of the whole adaptation of the whole trilogy. I'm like, you were a little wrong there because,
Right.
well, how many millions of people rewatch, all 3 extended editions of Lord of the Rings every year. So I kind of laughed at that. So I guess they wanted to go through, but even then, it's still odd that they would try to go to the ending of the trilogy as a sequel to The Hobbit. It was a bold choice, and there are issues that stem from that. But nonetheless, I mentioned, so as a kid, I did really enjoy this one. And I still really love the music in it. It's the same creative team as The Hobbit. So again, Glenn Yarborough's folk ballads are still really good on their own. I really enjoy, Frodo of the Nine Fingers and the Ring of Doom. It's a great song. But it's also the only reason the only way they could really tell the story when they don't have any pre-existing material here is, they open it with Bilbo and the Fellowship sitting at a table, and Bilbo asks, like, Frodo, you're missing a finger, and and I love how they hire the ballad guy to tell this story of and again, give a very condensed version, but I guess it does hit on the beats of Frodo and Sam's story. But again, upon rewatching this, I'm just thinking to myself, I'm like, all right, the movie is only an hour and 40 minutes. Do we really need an entire sequence of Sam imagining what it would be like if he had the ring, or an orc song about cracking the whip?
Come on, where there's a whip, where there's a way. Come on, it's a classic.
It's a great song. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just like, there were some fascinating narrative choices in this movie.
The animation studio was Topcraft, who had worked on the one before. They've also done stuff like Nausicaa. They worked on Frosty's Weird Wonderland, and The Last Unicorn.
Oh yeah.
Oh, this is why I was just so excited for this episode, because I knew I was going to learn stuff, and this is it is fascinating to look at this. But yeah, and like we've said, this is Return of the King, 1980 is very much a Frodo and Sam story. It takes place almost entirely in Mordor, opening in Cirith Ungol, going to them escaping, and almost getting captured by the orcs, eventually getting to Mount Doom, reuniting with Gollum, etc. As far as the stuff with Gondor, Minas Tirith, this is really other than a brief sequence toward the end where Aragorn and the men march to the gates of Mordor. They're pretty much, it's focused mainly on a very condensed version of the Battle of Pelennor Fields and Minas Tirith. And again, Faramir gets a complete shaft. It's like Denethor wrote this movie, because we get Denethor in it. We get no mention of Faramir. I felt bad for the dude here. And also, since we talked about how good the Nazgul were in the 78 film, here, I don't take credit for this. I saw this interview. They look very much like the villains in the 80s He-Man cartoon. Where I'm like, yeah, that fits. A lot of the terror there is gone. They look much campier. And it just feels like all of the stuff in Gondor, all of the narrative aspects of the men's storyline, and Aragorn's story, it's again just giving kind of a Wikipedia description. You don't really get any context for what's going on. Eowyn just kind of shows up and defeats the Witch King. There's a battle going on, but you don't really get context. And again, it's so odd that Aragorn gets about 2 lines maybe, and he shows up, and that's about it. So I don't know. I think in some ways, for a TV version that is, a sequel to The Hobbit, I get in one respect focusing more on Frodo and Sam, but
Right.
it's still just like it almost could have just been a different story altogether than trying to take on Return of the King without any other context of the previous chapters in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I wonder too if like they were trying to, and I haven't looked into this, but I wonder if they were just trying to capitalize on sort of like the rise in fantasy craze, especially with the popularity of Tolkien rising in the United States in the 70s in particular, with the paperbacks becoming available, which were also pirated. By the way, that's an interesting history. But and also I just want to make a comment about the Witch King's voice, like the high pitched, like, no man can kill me. It's very, very interesting. Very
something about it is not as intimidating as other incarnations.
Not quite. Yeah, apparently they started working on this almost as soon as possible as they were done with The Hobbit.
Oh yeah.
And they were going to call it Frodo the Hobbit 2, going straight to Return of the King, which they didn't have the rights for.
Yeah.
And
because they got sued over it too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess this will be interesting just because at that point, international copyright laws were not as kind of seamless. And even still, there's some issues still going on that people are working out on a global level. But Ace was a book company in the 70s. And because something happened in American law, they argued that they could print The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit without paying the Tolkien estate. And they did this and got away with it for a long time. And Tolkien was like, guess what? You can't do that. And so they finally ended up stopping after a year or two, something like that. And I think that I wonder if something similar was happening here where they were like, well, the paperbacks are doing it. I guess we can do it here too because the copyright laws say we can or something.
Wow.
Everything about the rights history of Tolkien is like its own beast. I'm sure, Nick, you've written about this stuff before, but it's like with the Rings of Power, it's like they only have the rights to a certain corner of the Tolkien universe, and so they tell this story. But yeah, I'm glad we got the Jackson trilogy, and we've gotten some pretty perfect adaptations, and we've gotten a lot of material. But yeah, this is just one of those. I think this really is a reflection of a lot of that, almost back and forth drama with trying to get the rights, and this is what we got. But I am glad it was not called Frodo the Hobbit 2. That is
agreed.
A terrible title. So at least we were saved of that. But even then, this could have been like the Hobbits or something. I don't know. It just feels weird slapping the Return of the King title on it when it only does a little. I guess it does. Focus on Frodo and Sam in where they are in that part of the story. And you still see the ring destroyed and everything. But yeah, there's just, I don't know. We can harp on this a lot as far as, we got another comment from Ian. I think these versions do have the best Gollum ever. That's what they say. Hey, the Gollum is great. It's the same version as in The Hobbit. I do love it as well. I think it's it's very creepy. The voice acting is great. So yeah, I know. I agree a lot there. It is a great depiction there.
Yeah, and I think too with because you were talking, like Christian was talking about, it was The Hobbit, and they immediately started optioning for Return of the King without knowing or without thinking about Bakshi's film. But WB acquired the rights, and so now they sell them, and it fits in a nice little trilogy. So just know, for people who are listening, these were not made to be watched in sequential order. It just ended up being lucky enough to happen that way. And then, of course, WB is lucky enough to have all three and sell them in a nice little box set. And, of course, give the rights to Max or whatever.
And that was the thing. This was the first time I watched all three in consecutive order because as a kid, I've seen the Backstreet one the most, and then seen the Hobbit one a lot of years. And it had been years since I'd watched Return of the King. But watching them in that release order is a fascinating, very incoherent trilogy.
It's so
But yeah,
true.
Most
but
definitely.
yeah. But there are still things again I really love about this movie: the music, the animation. But even though it is very focused on Frodo and Sam, it captures that relationship really well.
Yeah.
And the friendship and the the journey there from the beginning into end. Once again, though, Pippin and Merry get just Mary especially is barely in this. And that was the most disappointing thing about watching all these back to back was that a lot of those not even side characters but major players are really pushed to the side. So it does, and I think one of the things they could have done a little more is at the end when Frodo does go with Gandalf and Elrond and Bilbo to sail to the Grey Havens. They're like it is this tearjerker moment in the books and in the Jackson trilogy when he goes off and he has to say goodbye to Sam. And here it's like, okay, hey, I'll see you later. I'm like, you couldn't have shed a tear here. This is a big emotional moment. But so it felt a little weird that for them to capture that relationship so well and then to feel that goodbye, farewell, missing that emotional underpinning felt weird. But again, it's also only an hour and 40 minutes, and you had to have the crack the whip song taking up some screen time there.
This was necessary.
It is.
Those orcs refused to show up on the animation set unless they guaranteed the song would be there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. If they would have rotoscoped, I wonder how that would have affected it even further. They probably would have had a union or something.
The Union of the Orcs. That could have been the movie here.
Wow.
But yeah, so quite a fascinating adaptation. Any other thoughts on this one?
There are plenty of flaws with this one compared to the other two. Not to say the other twos are flawless, but if you want to watch them in sequential order, you're gonna have jarring differences between them, but they're still fun. For the time, this is all they had as far as animation, as far as seeing these characters brought to life. They're fine. They're fun. Enjoy them, and I'm looking forward to Rohirrim when that comes out.
Yeah. Yeah,
I have my tickets. Oh, I was saying I have my tickets for this weekend, so very much looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, seeing it Friday, and I'm just glad it exists because it just contributes to the success of Tolkien's universe and being without the Return of the King, we wouldn't. We probably who knows if we would have had a War of the Rohirrim, and it brings more people to Tolkien, which obviously I'm a fan of, and I know people who heard of Rings of Power, they watched it, they didn't like it, but now they're reading the books and they're getting into all the extra dirty stuff. What else can you ask for?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I just think about it too. It's for a long time, these were the only adaptations there. I mean, they had the radio adaptations like that, but as far as film depictions, there was a time before the Peter Jackson trilogy. I know it's hard to imagine for humanity, but there was a world without those. And so for a long time, these were, and they are, I mean, yeah, they still are very much celebrations of the Tolkien universe. And there's a lot to enjoy about them. And I think I had a great time rewatching and dissecting these and discussing them today. So it was a fascinating retrospective look. So yeah, if you still watch this whole episode and you haven't watched these movies, I do recommend go check them out on Max or get physical copies, but because it is quite the journey. Very cool. Well, this has been a great conversation here, guys. Before we wrap up here, would anyone like to recommend something either related to today's topic or just something else entirely?
I was telling Kevin before we recorded, I have an anti-recommendation today. I watched a film called Anai Ara. It was a 2018 film where basically, people are migrating from Earth to Mars and reconstructing it there, but our ship gets knocked off course, and now they're trying to figure out can they come back around, like their fuel is gone and everything, and it's just a hopeless, bleak, terrible film. I want nothing to do with it. I'm sure my nihilist friend here in in the chat could really enjoy it, Nick. But me, I'm like, nope, I'm done with you. I could have not watched this film and been better with my life. But that's me.
I'm gonna check it
Joshua's
out.
gonna laugh at this. So we go to the ask for recommendation part. Christian's like, never watch this movie. Like,
Yeah.
but Nick, what about you? And also, let's plug Nick your book right now since it just came out a month ago.
Yeah, I guess I'll make it my recommendation. But Tolkien and Pop Culture is the title of the book, and it's just a collection of my essays on kind of my explorations of Tolkien and his influence on other pop cultural artifacts, and then even also kind of you reading some of those in a Tolkienian lens. So that's available on Amazon, both ebook and physical edition. Actually, and I'll recommend somebody other than me so I don't sound so vain. But Kevin, I'm with Kevin. I have been having a great time with the Skeleton Crew. It's only 2 episodes so far, but I was so surprised at how enjoyable of an enjoyable time I was having. Like, just felt like a kid watching the Goonies for the first time, and hopefully it continues.
It's a great time as well. Like I rewatched the Goonies the other day, and it's so fun comparing them. But yeah, I'm really excited. So new episode drops tomorrow. Cannot wait. But yeah.
Oh yeah.
And my recommendation will be, and I've only seen this movie once, but since we were talking about Bakshi, it was the film he made. I think we mentioned on this, but he made right before Lord of the Rings, called Wizards, which is like, and I don't even know if because I've only seen it once, so I don't even know if I can call it objectively good or not. But like, I watched it a few years ago, got a copy from the Alamo Draft House, rented it there, and I just remember like whether it's good or not, like I can't even tell you much about the story because it was kind of a really ambitious post-apocalyptic sci-fi fantasy hybrid, but the animation style and just the world building was fascinating, and it very much fused live action and animation together. So if you want to get more of a taste of Bakshi's work and dive into that, I do recommend that. I believe it came out in '76, if I'm not mistaken, 76 or 77. But yeah, so it's just called Wizards. Mark Hamill even has a small voice role in that.
That'd be a fun one to do an episode on, because I know the ending is very divisive with some people.
Yeah. And I would love to rewatch it and kind of formulate more of an opinion. But yeah, awesome. Well, guys, this was an absolute blast, and for our viewers and listeners out there, I want to thank you for joining us. If you like this and you want to hear more and you want to check us out, leave us a 5-star review. Head to our YouTube, our Discord, Patreon. And this way you can suggest episode topics. You can chime in on conversations. We would love to hear from you all. We want to thank all of our Patreons for supporting us. It is a huge appreciation there. And just remember, we are all a chosen people, a geekdom of priests.